can be more. There's nothing that I can't achieve if I just believe. You can be more. You can make every dream a reality. We can be more. Be more, be more.
Yeah.
I can be more.
I wake up every day and try to be more. I pray I be more. It's easy to achieve anything you believe. Like hold your head high. Girl, you got a reason to breathe. I see a rare mind. Boy, you got a reason to dream. Let's take flight. Give the children a reason to see redemption. We grow up in the jacks where it's evil and wicked. Where the people with success don't want to send you a visit. But we still finna make this life worth living. Now throw your hands to the sky if you feel it. Hey, throw your hands to the sky if you the realest. You got a vision, let's put them pistols away and make sure the OGs keep the community safe. In the world where the ladies crying, the babies dying, I think we can create that space to make a way for the ladies to ride and make baby giants. Be more, believe, let's play. I'm so in love with life.
There's nothing that I can achieve if I just believe. You can be more. You can make every dream a reality. We can be more.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Chop Shop. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm your host, Pastor Marvin McKinstry, and flying with me, as always, is my left hand and my right hand. He's my main man behind the scenes, Shaka Pitts. He's making the magic happen. Before I bring in this illustrious panel tonight, as we begin to further the conversation around what's going on in our city and in our country, protest on the rise, we want to talk about what's next. But before I bring in my panel, I want to share a few updates today. First and foremost, we want to take a pause for the cause, as today the nation really paused to celebrate the life of George Floyd. In a stirring eulogy today, Reverend Al Sharpton said that it's time for us to stand up and to tell the nation to get their knees off our necks. A very stirring eulogy today. I really enjoyed it. Great to see people come together and rally around his family. Our thoughts and our prayers continue to be with them. Likewise, in that same case, Derek Chauvin, the man who was accused of the murder of George Floyd, charges were upgraded from third degree to second degree murder, which carries a significant penalty, significantly greater penalty, where he could be facing up to 40 years. Likewise, the other three officers in the case were also finally charged. They've been charged with aiding and abetting, and like him are held with $1 million bails, and are facing up to 40 years in prison as well. Finally, want to just close out this opening with our Governor Larry Hogan took the time during his COVID-19 update just to celebrate and to salute the protest that's been happening here in Baltimore. We've been in this process for 5 years now, and you've seen everything from peaceful protests to people who are on boots on the ground, frontliners on the regular, defending the city and making sure that the protests didn't turn to burning, with agitators and all kinds of people coming into our city that don't mean well. Well, the governor acknowledged this today, and he celebrated yesterday, and he celebrated how Baltimore set the example for the rest of the nation with that being said, I want to begin to bring in my panel today. We're going to be talking about the furtherance of the work. One of the things that I think happened last time is we had an amazing opportunity presented to us, and we did what we knew, and we worked with diligence, but it never quite made it from Baltimore to Annapolis in the case of policing here locally. So what we want to do is we want to now have a conversation with the leading advocates, the people who take the conversation from Baltimore to Annapolis, so that we will know what needs to happen beyond this protest. That's why the show is titled, What's Next? What do we do next, right? So tonight I got with me a very esteemed panel of people who are great legal minds and people who understand this stuff. Many of them have educated me throughout my process of being a part of CODIF and the other opportunities that I've been blessed with being in this work. So I want to start off with our very own State Senator Jill Carter is with us tonight. Yeah, you got to unmute, get unmuted.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Thanks, Pastor McKinstry, for having this. It's a pleasure to see all of you. And I hope that we can offer some good information to everybody that's listening.
All right. Senator Carter is also the former director of the Mayor's Office of Equal Opportunity. Is that right? No, I said it wrong. What is it?
Equity and Civil Rights now.
Equity and Civil Rights, where our very own Civilian Review Board is housed, the body of people who's supposed to do the civilian oversight of our police department. And I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the ways that needs to be beefed up. We also have with us tonight one of my, he's my little brother, but when it comes down to some of this stuff, he's my big brother. Brother Davon Love from an organization called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We had the opportunity to partner with them on some of the work on CODIF. I got to know this brother, and he's a brother that knows his stuff. Come on, introduce yourself, Davon.
Hey, appreciate you for having me. Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I'm looking forward to having a good conversation about how we can make sure that the work gets done. And that's what it's always about.
All right. So next up, we got Miss Ganesha Martin, who was she's the former director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and she was one of the negotiators at the table when our consent decree was negotiated as one of the lead attorneys, a part of the BPD legal team. Come on and talk to us, Ganesha.
Hey, everybody. I'm so blessed and uplifted to be here with you all tonight, especially with Pastor McKinstry. And really, Davon and Senator, we all came together in 2015, and people were asking the hard questions. Me and Marvin were fussing and crying at each other. And so, I'm just blessed to be here and glad for us to try to pick up the torch where we left it, and move forward and make sure that the community is involved in doing that too. All
right. And last but certainly not least, I saved up for last, we have one of my colleagues from the Community over Civilian Oversight Task Force. And I continue to call her my colleague because we've had the honor and privilege of establishing a 501c3 with Denise Duval called Reconcile Baltimore. I'm going to give her the opportunity to talk about that. Dr. Danielle, listen, one of the most brilliant young women I've ever met in my life, right from West Baltimore, Gilmore Homes. Dr. Danielle Kushner. Come on, talk to us, Dr. Danny.
Thank you, Marvin, so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. As Marvin mentioned, we were colleagues on the Community Oversight Task Force, which was charged with studying our current system of civilian oversight, studying other models across the nation, and coming up with recommendations for strengthening that system. We're also colleagues on our new nonprofit, Reconcile Baltimore, which we've established in partnership with BPD, working on having citizens and police officers go through a series of trust building activities and programming to try to build trust and to try to improve police community relations in the city. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and hopefully we can get some good information to people so they can support our actions and our bills in Annapolis next legislative session.
Thank you, Dr. Danny. And we're gonna jump right into the meat of the conversation, y'all. Last week we kicked the chop shop off with our very first episode, and we had some leading advocates, boots on the ground. Some of the people on this panel do that work as well, but we had some of the leading advocates to talk about from Baltimore to Minneapolis, right? 5 years after Freddie Gray, how do we find ourselves in this same space as a nation? And even locally, do you see or feel like there's some progress that has been made? Senator Card, I want to start with you.
Thanks for asking me the question. So we talk about in terms of 2015, but actually well before 2015, even before the in custody death of Freddie Gray, frankly, on the heels of the 2012 death of Trayvon Martin, when the Malcolm X grassroots organization put out a report that every 28 hours a Black man, woman, or child was killed in America at the hands of law enforcement, that got my attention. And so I began to talk to people on all sides of the issue, including law enforcement, to come up with ways that we could fix this problem with policing. And so over those years, I put in a series of different bills. But around 2014 and 2015, a lot of advocacy groups got on board, and we decided to focus primarily on changing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. After the legislature turned a blind eye to advocacy groups and the legislation and mothers who came making desperate pleas about making change because their children had been killed at the hands of law enforcement officers, and all of that, hundreds of people protesting and testifying, the legislature did nothing, willfully did nothing. So within a week of leaving legislative session in 2015, Freddie Gray happened. And so the legislature called together, I used to call it the legislative play group, but they called together what they call the work group with both houses to grapple with this issue and come up with plausible legislation. All they really did was take combination of my bills and other legislators' bills that they had ignored, watered them down, and passed something that was completely impotent and didn't fix anything. So, also, as you know, around that time, we get the consent decree, which I'm sure Ganesha will talk about. But, just from my vantage point, one of the greatest flaws with that consent decree was the fact that it did not incorporate civilian oversight as a permanent structure in the ongoing effort of fixing policing. There should have never been, I know we'll disagree because you all are valuable as a civilian oversight task force, but I never thought there should have been a temporary civilian oversight task force. There should have been, in that document, the consent decree, permanent, independent civilian oversight.
We don't disagree, but hold it right there, Senator Carter, because I got a different tag for each one of y'all. You kind of touching all of it, but I want to jump over to Davon. Davon, Lee Ober, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. Can you please, brother, give us some quick grassroots information? And for my listening audience, right, you're going to hear some legal jargon, and this is the group that can put it as plain as day. But even in the midst of them putting it as plain as day, I want you to grab a notepad, because this is what's going to tell us how to find ourselves out of this problem in the long term. So talk to us about the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights.
So what's important about the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, or LEOBR, is that it was codified in Maryland in 1974. There are 16 states that have Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. And so essentially it's done in the framework of like a labor agreement, right? And so in the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights are a series of protections that law enforcement officers receive that in many respects are above and beyond their constitutional rights. One kind of historical note that's actually really fascinating, and doing some archival research, in 1975, Maryland actually hosted a national convention of fraternal orders of police to basically convene about the construction nationally of Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights. So it's really something that the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the union that represents police officers, it was really something that goes back a long time, and that many of the structures that we're seeing that impede police accountability have been in place for many years. and that there have been many, administrations and many legislatures that have kind of left those protections in place. And so some of the things that are included in the Law Enforcement and Officer Bill of Rights, I'll just give a few of them. One of the ones that is for a lot of people, it's one of the most stunning, is that prior to the 2016 legislative session, and I think, Senator Carter is exactly right that that bill that the leadership of Annapolis ended up passing was almost nothing. And so one of the things that it did change was that before 2016, an officer who was alleged to have engaged in brutality had 10 days before they were required to make a statement on the record about what happened in the particular incident. And I'm sure as your listeners could assume, that means that the officer gets a bunch of time to figure out what they're going to say. Right, exactly. Additionally, the officer is entitled to all of the information that is against them prior to the actual proceeding, the trial boards. That's the internal disciplinary boards to determine discipline for law enforcement officers.
So, Dave, I can talk with you through these, right? Because what I want to do is be able to balance it out against what happens with the average citizen. So in that first case, they get 10 days. If it's Marvin McKinstry, I'm in the interrogation box with the hot light on me, and they trying to get everything out of me in some cases, whether I have legal representation or not. The second thing that you were talking about, a right to all of the information, is something that in the regular court system would be called discovery. And my lawyer has to file a motion to get that information on my behalf. And in a lot of cases, I can't even prepare proper defense, but this is something that's surrendered to the police officer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
That's imbalanced. Come on, you can keep on telling us. I just wanted to show those how different it is for a regular citizen versus a police officer.
Absolutely. And so the change that was made in 2016 is it was 10 days. Now it's 5 business days, which still is way too much time, for an officer to be able to get their story together. Now, what the Fraternal Order of Police would say is that officers themselves, have a right not to speak, right? So all of us have the Fifth Amendment right. We don't, we're not obligated to incriminate ourselves. And so that's the argument they use to justify their position. I would argue that as an agent of the state that is authorized to use deadly force in the name of the public, that that the kinds of protections that officers get impede our ability to hold them accountable for the deadly and violent force that they are sanctioned to use. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be really important, like kind of big picture, because there are a bunch of other, minutiae about the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights that need to be dealt with. But the overall picture is that the police union frames the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights as a way for police officers to have a fair shake, the same way that any other public sector employee would have, in terms of the benefits of union representation. And I think it's going to be really important, for your listeners and for the general public to know that, law enforcement officers and their use of labor agreements, of the negotiation of the contract with the city and the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, them hiding behind labor protections and them basically saying that their officers deserve a lot of those same rights doesn't account for the fact that officers are again, empowered by the state to use deadly force. And so we need mechanisms of accountability, right? We need to be able to levy consequences against those, because the only deterrent to, brutality is the ability to leverage power. There's one other thing I also want to say, something that actually Senator Carter taught me years ago that really framed how I understood how politics work in Baltimore and the state of Maryland. The Democratic Party is really good at presenting symbolic gestures and calling it progress without actually changing the actual institutional arrangement to produce the results we want. And so to your question about we're here 5 years later, what happened? What happened was the Democrats did what they always did, which is tell people they're going to overstate what it is they're going to deliver on, but they don't actually want to run up against the FOP and the actual political power that the FOP has. And so I think it's going to be really important, in the upcoming session and just in general, it's going to be important that as a community, we don't accept the symbolic gestures. We don't accept the things that politicians say, oh, we can only get this done. I think as a community, we got to get behind folks like Senator Carter and really push the issue. Otherwise, we're going to get what we got 5 years ago.
Wow. And we got a comment from my sister, Sheena McCleary. The police should be held to the same or even higher accountability because they are paid to protect and serve. I'm coming to you, Ganesha, and I want to say to you, 5 years later with a consent decree, you give us some basis of what the consent decree is and what it's designed to do. And then 5 years later with a consent decree here in Baltimore, do you feel like we made any progress?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a huge proponent of the consent decree. Before we even implemented the consent decree, I ran around the country to other cities to see what they had done right and what they had done wrong. I think in a lot of instances, they started with technology last. A lot of people are like, why technology? Why technology? Because when the Department of Justice came to Baltimore City and wanted to know if we were desperately stopping Black folks, all the paperwork was in a box in a room somewhere. We need technology so that, if the community is asking at a community meeting, you know what, I think you're desperately stopping, young African-American males in my community. We should be able to hit a button and do some analytics and pull a report. And if that's true, we need to do something about it. And if it's not, we need to be very transparent and let the community know. The other thing, that really did not happen in other places was you took police officers with no background, with no education, and asked them to be reform experts, organizational change experts, equity experts. And that just doesn't work. That's not what they were trained to do. That's not what they were educated to do. It's a paramilitary organization. And so when we talk about, what policing needs to look like in the future, we need to recognize that police departments are not built right now to actually implement. They can do the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law really requires a different type of thinking that is not the part of the DNA, of a police department. The other thing that I found and I tried to implement in Baltimore, and I hope we get to this because I want to make sure that, I think it needs to happen better, is you got to have both police and community at the table. When you're talking about policy, you need to have both. When you talk about training, you have to have both. When you talk about accountability, you have to have both. And so, I think that in that realm, in Baltimore City, we have to really improve. But having a consent decree, at least we have something. Since I've left the police department, I've been working nationally. Our consent decree was the last consent decree under this administration. We actually had to fight Jeff Sessions and Trump to keep it in Baltimore City. And so we at least have something to hold folks accountable to. Now, I still think most people in Baltimore don't know what the consent decree is. So while we talk about holding people accountable, if we're not using that mechanism to do that, then that's the problem. I also agree with Senator Carter. To her point, CODIF did a whole report. Ain't nobody looked at it. Ain't nobody implemented it. And so, I think that's another problem. I mean, people need to be pissed off that we did all this work. People lost their lives. People marched things. I mean, all the things that have happened. The reason why people are out there standing and making sure people not burning Baltimore City is because of what happened back in the day. And we're trying to move forward. But we still need to be asking these questions. We went through all of this negotiation. We specifically put things in there like, unlike any other consent decree across the United States, interactions with youth, period. Because what were we finding? We were finding that at the end of pursuits, excessive force was being used on young people just because they ran. Who's asking questions about that right now? Like, I had to go onto the consent decree website to read through what was going on to figure out what was happening. And I just don't think that that's part of the collective consciousness in Baltimore City. So I do think we need to utilize that a bit more. We need to educate the community and translate all that legal language into actually actionable, ways to hold the police department accountable and making sure that the community's voice is heard and everything that's being implemented in the consent decree. The other thing I have to say though is that the consent decree only gets us part of the way there. I mean, to Davon's point, Libor is not even affected by the consent decree. As a matter of fact, that's something we had to really talk about while we were negotiating, that, you know, these are things that are put on the police department, but at the end of the day, you still have people in the police department that the community can call their name, but they still were out there on the streets. And the commissioner, you know, who knew from talking to the community and talking to different people that these people needed to go, you still had to jump through all these hoops and all these different things to deal with people that were problems in our community, that were on a routine basis, antagonizing and being aggressive and brutal in some cases. So, you know, I think we have to, first of all, we have a lot of mechanisms that we need to use better, but we also have to, you know, make sure we're supporting the senator and Davon when we go back to Annapolis, because the consent decree didn't and it couldn't go far enough.
And I'm glad you kind of gave me a segue. And listen, I promise y'all, after this pointed question to Dr. Carter, Dr. Kushner, we are going to jump all the way into the organic flow, where I want you guys to talk to each other. And I'm going to let you know right off the top. On this platform, agreement is not a prerequisite. The people need to hear what's real and what's best. The only thing we do is we respectfully disagree. Dr. Kushner, civilian oversight, right? Our wonderful Senator Carter was about to go into it, right? And I kind of paused on it because we, even as code, have learned enough to know that a civilian oversight task force versus having something that was implemented in the consent decree was kind of a joke, right? And we made some effort to try to get it put into the consent decree to no avail. But talk to us about civilian oversight, and then from there, man, we're gonna open this thing up. I do want to say to our viewers real quick, if you want to, I just ended my watch party. Go onto my page and jump in the original live. We'll be able to get your questions and your comments on the screen so that our panel can talk and correspond directly with you if you got questions. So Dr. Carter, talk to us. Dr. Kushner, talk to us.
My maiden name is Carter, which is why I think you keep thinking.
That's what I'm struggling with.
All right. So you asked about 5 years after Freddie Gray, has there been any progress? And I would say that any progress that's been made in Baltimore City since then has been minimal at best. We still have instances of young Black people being harassed by the police. We still have caught on video police officers using excessive force while we're under a consent decree, right? And so these problems still exist, and they're still very problematic. I think that the reason we keep seeing the use of excessive force by police officers is in part connected to what Senator Carter began to say, which is that the whole issue of community oversight was not incorporated into the consent decree. And of course, what that means in practice is that it's not going to be a priority for the Baltimore Police Department or for the city even more generally. And so, you know, if you have an effective civilian oversight agency, then people can have confidence, right? That when officers engage in misconduct, that there's a process that they can trust, an impartial, independent process that they can use to bring about justice. Of course, we don't have that kind of civilian oversight body here in Baltimore. An effective civilian oversight body is able to collect data, issue reports to let citizens know what's happening with respect to policing. They work on policy issues. And these type of civilian oversight agencies, it's important to note, do exist in the United States currently, right? We love the model in Denver, where it's a threefold model, where you have investigators, people who are monitoring incidents of misconduct, and dealing with the complaints that come in terms of the complaints that citizens file against officers. You also have policy analysts who are working on the legislative side. And you also have a community engagement arm. So these types of civilian oversight bodies actually do exist. It's been shown that they work, they help to reduce police misconduct. But until we have something like that in place, I don't think that Baltimoreans will ever be confident that we can have a process or an institutional mechanism for bringing about justice.
So I'm looking at the numbers on my Facebook Live, right? And this week they kind of fluctuate and they go up and then they go out, which is a perfect segue into where I want to go kind of with this next question, because last week when we were talking boots on the ground, the protests, the uprising, buildings burning, thousands of people flooding downtown Baltimore, it was a sexier conversation. This conversation right here is not so much that appealing conversation with the legal jargon, right? But I'm going to throw this one out there, and I guess, Senator Carter, you can start us off. What would it look like if the numbers of protesters that you get in downtown Baltimore would show up in Annapolis during session?
I think that it would be meaningful. I think at this point, it will help make the difference. But like I said, back in 2015, the legislature really wasn't serious about it, so it didn't matter how many people were there. But, because now, and I just want to talk about right now, because now the Speaker of the House has, based on what happened with George Floyd and the national outcry, has decided to put together yet a second House work group. So, the significant thing to me is that with everything that's been going on in Maryland, the legislature hasn't been moved to pass meaningful legislation, but now with George Floyd, they are. Here's the thing. When we have these protests, we have to have the people that are speaking at the protest and organizing the protest be prepared to continue the organization and the mobilization of people to the legislature where the laws change. Briefly, I do believe that we are postured to pass more meaningful legislation than the past now. The reason that I believe that is that even though the body sat on significant bills for the last 2 years, the first 2 years of this term, there's a commitment to pass some of these bills. With respect to civilian oversight, we know that one of the impediments is Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, because it precludes the interrogation or investigation of officers by anyone that is not a certified licensed law enforcement officer. And so in order to have adequate civilian oversight, we have to repeal that part. And first of all, I don't go by anything that I'm told because I've been, misled before, but I've been given the belief by leadership that we are going to take that issue seriously. Also, the protection of police disciplinary records. And just briefly, and I won't be too long on this, but I think this is a really good point. When I started this, I focused, as so many people did, on the things that occur later in law enforcement process, like arrests and prosecutions for criminal acts by law enforcement officers, and like trial boards of officers. But what I've learned and really know that the way to change this culture is at the administrative disciplinary level. And the only way that we can do that is we have to have civilian oversight, because we know that internal affairs divisions have traditionally not adequately, fairly disciplined officers that need it. And once they don't get disciplined there, they never make it to a trial board. They never make it any place beyond that because it's swept under the rug. And so one of the bills we have this session that we're going to push is this Maryland Public Information Act legislation, which would exempt the police records, personnel files, from the protection under personnel files, their disciplinary records. And so that's a big deal. That's something we have to have happen so that the public will know what these records, what these disciplinary actions that occur are, what these acts that happen with officers are.
So we talking more transparency. I'm sorry, were you still talking, Senator Carter?
Well, yeah, because first of all, if you have a combination of civilian oversight that has teeth, and if you have the knowledge of what these officers are doing and what the discipline is, then it's going to be more difficult to sweep their bad acts under the rug by the internal agency Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like,
we talking more transparency, right?
what we know is that most of the officers that we find out about have a trail of incidents where they were never disciplined. And
just
so,
like Derek Chauvin.
right.
Yeah, just like Derek Chauvin, 18 prior complaints. I see Ganesha look like she want to jump in there. She chopping at the bit. Come on, Ganesha.
I got so many things to say, but you know what? We always talk about let's go after the violent repeat offenders. Let's go after the people that are terrorizing our communities. Like, you know, every police officer is not bad, but every bad police officer makes it 10 times worse for a good police officer. And so, you know, one of the things after the GTTF, after folks was arrested, and I had been in the police department a couple of years by that time, but after police, they were arrested, you had more police show up and start saying, I know people that are doing something. I know people that are doing something. I know people that are doing something. So, you know, what I want to add to this conversation, you know, is not only where the advocates and the activists are making a space for community to know what's going on, we also have to make it just as important in the police department so that people, when they see that people are held accountable, that they continue to speak up about these officers. I mean, there were officers there who for years, I mean, we're not even talking, this is 18. I'm way more than that. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we want to come out of this conversation with action. And I do have to say, I am disheartened. We got to figure this out, because every time we do, we talk about what the solution is. Like, I understand we're mad, we come with emotion, but we have got to translate that emotion to action, because it's to be preventative. You know, so that we are holding people accountable. Don't tell me when you have somebody that is sitting on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and moving his knee so as to cause more harm to him, that is a messed up person. I'm gonna respect it. We might have church people on this thing. So that's an effed up individual. Don't tell me that it was on that day that he decided to be demented. No, he has been demented for years. And I guarantee you, as soon as that happened, several people, there was hallway conversations by police that was like, I knew it was gonna happen eventually. So, you know, a lot of my questions are, who was this guy in the police department? Who was he protected by? How was he able to go all of this time without being called out and held accountable? And it's not just because all police are bad. It is because the accountability mechanisms are not strong for people to stand up inside police departments, and we don't have, to the senator's point, the transparency outside of the police department. So, you know, one of the things that I would suggest is that we focus on those bad apples. The community knows those names. They knew the names of the GTTF. This was not new. The public defenders knew. The state's attorneys knew. They're not even calling them for testimony. All of the people who know need to stand up and say, these are the people. What are we doing? Let's look at them as a case study, and make sure that when we are trying to change the laws, what we're trying to do, we are addressing what we already know to be happening, as opposed to, because I think that can help too, Davon, to what you were talking about, when they want to come back and say, well, let's not talk about in general. Let's talk about the facts. You know what I'm saying? So
again, to all of our audience, our listening audience, you are tuned into the Chop Shop tonight, where we have Senator Jill Carter, Brother Davon Love, Ganesha Martin, and Dr. Danielle Kushner talking about what are the next steps, what do we need to do next. And we got a question that I want to get to, and I want to throw this question at Brother Davon Love, because we've had some pretty stirring conversation around this particular question. Accountability in policing is a problem, Nisha McCoy says. Do you think that the police union is a problem? I want you to open up that can of you know what on the police union you got sitting there, Davon.
So I think one of the most important ways to understand the Fraternal Order of Police is that it is an institution that is subsidized by public dollars, that is a special interest group for a community of people that have historically disrespected our community, right? And I think it's really important that we frame it that way.
Say that one more time for me.
So the Fraternal Order of Police, right, as a police union, it is a organization that is subsidized by public dollars, right? A third of the city's budget typically goes to the police. So, a couple budgets ago, Baltimore City broke $500 million that it gives over to police. I think Baltimore has more, it's the second highest police officers per capita of any jurisdiction in the country. So it is so the police union is a organization subsidized by the public that acts as a special interest group. So they're able to fund legislative advocacy against me, against Senator Carter, against the folks trying to, make a difference. And they're able to fund that advocacy against the things we need, which allows a community, the police department, the Fraternal Order of Police, an entity that has historically abused our community and have denied the existence of the way in which racism impacts our community. Right, we as taxpayers are funding the advocacy against the things we want to see that will help to improve the condition of our community and the relationship that we have with police. And I think that's really important because the police union operates in many respects like a gang, right? They operate in ways where just one like aesthetic example. This isn't like major. I remember a few years ago when we were going down, doing police reform work where officers they filled the entire committee room. So they had police officers who sat in every seat in the committee room so that they had community people standing on the walls, right? So that's the level of like gang-like mentality that the Fraternal Order of Police operates with. And so I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that a lot of times we focus on, individual bad police officers. What we don't talk about, though, is that the culture in American civil society that is fundamentally baked into it, the lack of respect for the humanity of Black people, right? There's a study that I would advise, all your listeners to get. It's called The Essence of Innocence. It was written in 2014 by a guy named Dr. Philip Goff. And in that report, they do studies where they look at police officers and they look at their attitudes about particularly Black youth. And what they find in this study is that Black youth between the ages of 13 to 21 are understood, are read by police officers as 6 to 7 years older than their actual age. So when they see a 13-year-old Black boy,
you see a 19-year-old.
They see him as 19 years old, right? And what happens, the reason why that there's that age difference is because the assumption is that Black folks are inherently less innocent and are more prone to criminality, right? So this isn't like what Davon think, right? This is, that's a study. So it's not what Davon think. It is
I told y'all my engineer was bad.
Absolutely, that was quick.
Go ahead and email that.
It is a social scientific study that substantiates the fact that it don't matter who you are. If you socialize in America, you're going to develop these notions about Black people that would allow you to devalue Black life in the capacity of being a police officer. And then the second reason why talking about the FOP is important, in addition to the fact that, again, like I just mentioned, the function of white supremacy and how it operates on our conscience, the other thing that's really important is that the Fraternal Order of Police, particularly as it relates to the contract negotiations with the city. Because the thing about contract negotiations is that the public is not entitled to participation in the contract negotiations. So it's the city and it's the FOP, right? And so a part of why the FOP is so dangerous is because they're able, like I mentioned before, to use the structure of collective bargaining to insulate themselves from, and it's illegal when you're doing collective bargaining. Neither side can disclose the nature of the conversations that they're having by law about what they're negotiating. So it makes it so that the conversations exclusively between the FOP and the city about what they negotiate in the contract. So it's just a tool that the FOP is able to use that really gets in the way of being able to have the kind of policies that can actually address the things that we're looking at. So I think it's important for us to really think about ways to undermine the power the FOP has.
So let me poke the bear a little bit more, because today I posted a picture, right? And my man Baron Smith said, how can the FOP be held accountable, right? I posted a picture today that showed some of our police officers kneeling and with extended hand towards some of the protesters. And I want to shout out Officer Otis Daniels, who was depicted in the picture, because he's a real one, a brother who I've worked with and has brought young people into my office to give them an option where they can get a job as opposed to facing prosecution, right? The squeegee boys, he grabs them off the corner, puts them in the vehicle, and he brings them to my office and give them opportunity. So I don't want to vilify the individual in the picture, but I gotta say this because Senator Carter came on the post and said, yeah, that'll be cool when they join us in Annapolis to say we tired and we want the legislation to be fixed. What would it look like if you had officers coming and telling and saying to the FOP, you know, we don't want this to be our representation? Do you ever see something like that happening, Senator Carter?
I think we're getting closer to it, but to be honest with you, over the years, I've had so many conversations with particularly Black officers who came quietly in complaint about the racism, discrimination, about having to endure, watch, know about, participate in excessive force and brutality, and not wanting to do it, but being afraid for their own lives. So they don't have enough protections to do it, but you know, hopefully they could stand up for the union at some point. I just want to briefly answer the question. The legislature has the power to change all of it. The legislature created collective bargaining for the police, for the FOP. We could repeal it. It doesn't have to be the law. And that's the very simple kind of thing I want people to understand. We don't have to accept these circumstances. You know, this is all a product of laws and legislation. If the legislature said, you know, we're going to get rid of the collective bargaining, repeal, over, done. They didn't always even have collective bargaining. We have a lot of power, but there's a disconnect between, because there's so little political education in our upbringing and in our psyche, we don't ever fully understand where the source of our problem is and how we can fix it. And hopefully we'll work together to change that.
So one of the economic changes that people are looking for is a lot of what goes into, because we talked about a $500 million in one budget cycle going to BPD and pulling some of that money out of there to do some educating and some education around the various processes that can make this thing different. I want to go over to Dr. Kushner. And Dr. Kushner, you know, Reconcile Baltimore 501c3, that believes wholeheartedly in the healing of the relationship between Baltimore police and the citizens. I don't say the community and the police department, because the police department should be a part of the community. You know what I mean? It shouldn't be separate and apart. And we know what the reality has been up until now, but specifically focusing on our language to talk about police and citizens. What talk a little bit about that relationship piece and how essential that is to the big picture, even as we start to talk about a change in legislation.
Mm-hmm. And I'm eager to get to the discussion about reconcile and healing, but if I could for just a moment, I want to come back to this point that Davon was making about how we get taxed, right, as citizens. When the Community Oversight Task Force finalized this report and its recommendations for putting in place a system of effective civilian oversight, we had meetings with a number of individuals in local government to basically gauge the response to this report. And one of the reasons that was given over and over again is that what we wanted, the system of oversight that we were asking for, was too bold and it was too expensive. I believe what we were asking for was something like 3% of the police budget, so maybe $15 million a year to operate. Now,
you know, if I can jump in, the interesting thing about that conversation is we were greeted in the city solicitor's office with that conversation about what wouldn't happen prior to us ever getting to the point that we had recommendations. That they wanted the focus to be on one thing. So it's interesting that they would come back and then want to hide behind money, especially when some of the things to do with getting control of our police department back is about tort liability, that we paying all the money in the first place. I'm sorry, Dr. Kushner, I had to throw that there.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's exactly where I was going. So if we're talking about, we're saying $15 million to put in place an effective system of oversight, a system that actually holds officers accountable for misconduct. Now, when we look at all the lawsuits that the city gets hit with because of police misconduct, we're talking about millions of dollars that the city is paying out. We're talking about us, our residents, Baltimoreans, are basically paying for Black Death, paying for police brutality against us, right? And so a forward-thinking person would realize that if you have an effective system of oversight in place, it, in some instances, will certainly act as a deterrent to misconduct, because officers know that there's a serious, that is very likely that they're actually going to be charged and maybe will be in prison for what they're doing. So if you have an effective system of oversight, eventually you're going to stop getting hit with all these lawsuits for police brutality. And that in itself will result in cost savings to the city, savings to us as taxpayers. And then, so I'll stop with that. But to go over to the Reconcile piece, we started Reconcile Baltimore because, and let me just say that Reconcile Baltimore is not the beginning of this work. What we're trying to do is build on the great work that's being done by advocates all over the city. But the main goal of Reconcile Baltimore is, as I said earlier, to work on building trust building between police officers and civilians, right? And so we envision a system where every year in each police district, we have a cohort of citizens and residents coming together, going through extensive trust building programming. And if that is effective, right, we expect a certain level of healing to come about. We expect a certain level of reconciliation. We expect that through that relationship building, officers who mostly come into the city from Baltimore County and all these other counties in Maryland and don't really understand the city, that through that relationship building, some of those misconceptions that they have about us as a people will lead to reduce police brutality, because officers are less likely to operate from blanket stereotypes about us, right? And we also expect it to lead to reduced crime, because when you have a level of trust between community and the police, that means cooperation from the community. You're never going to reduce crime in the city if people don't trust the police and don't cooperate with the police. And so we see Reconcile Baltimore as doing both things: building trust, reducing police misconduct, but also helping to reduce crime.
And that's one of the things that we see as a necessity, as we see right now the grassroots activism community partnering kind of with the police for the protection of our city, as many of our advocates here, including Davon, you were out on Friday, I believe that was, Monday. That was to make sure that protests stay peaceful. I want to come back to you again, Anisha, because we've heard the conversation of the consent decree being overshadowed by Leober and things of that nature. Being one of the people that sat down in the negotiations, and I'm not sure if you're at liberty to say anything or not, but when those things were raised during the process of negotiations, were they raised and rejected? Because we know it was a three-party negotiation between BPD, the city of Baltimore, and the DOJ. Were there some more robust and more aggressive things from the BPD standpoint that they were willing to participate in that was pushed back?
There were things that were raised. There were things that were raised about Libor, and there was things that was raised even about what should be done as it relates to the state's attorney's office. But all of the lawyers in the room were like, as you would look at any, cause of action, it's like you're going to lose. I mean, the federal government understood the bounds of what they could do under the federal laws that they were bringing the pattern and practice, the lawsuit for. So, I mean, those things were just kind of dead on arrival because that was just the law. You can't, we had to work even diligently to the senator's point earlier about the disciplinary records. It's very different. Like, for instance, in Seattle, literally they started a streaming channel with just all body camera, blurred face, but it's every body camera that any police officer has. Every disciplinary record comes out with some redaction. We have one of the strongest laws as it relates to personnel record disclosure, I think, in the country. And so even the DOJ, there were certain things that the DOJ had to fight to get even during their investigation. So, I wouldn't say that, folks push back. I would just say that, again, and this is why I think the Congressional Black Caucus, I know Kamala, Senator Harris and Booker are putting forth some legislation. The Supreme Court, for the first time, I don't want to say first time ever, but certainly the first time I ever heard of it, is considering the qualified immunity of police officers while we're talking about, suing them. And so the conversation is changing because other people are paying attention and asking questions. And so while a lot of those things might have been off the table because people just knew they were sacred cows, it's certain things that you're just not going to win on. We're in a situation now with protests in every city and in several different countries where we can start, I think, approaching these things, again, not from just an individual level, but what is it that we have to change on a national level, a state level, and a local level to be able to effectuate the change that we're talking about. And one other point that I just want to make here, and I actually had this conversation with Phil Goff last year about this. We often focus on the police department, which I understand. But at the end of the day, the police commissioner, as we've seen, he gets straight fired when bodies keep dropping. Not a problem. He's gone. So, he's an employee. Those same threats, I can tell you, are not made when it comes to reform. The same threats are not made when it comes to holding folks accountable. The same threats are not made when it comes to the consent decree. I can tell you right now, I was never called over to City Hall because you're not doing a consent decree. What we called over to City Hall all the time because people were still dying in Baltimore City. And that obviously is very important. And that is something that anybody who takes that job needs to be called on the carpet for. But we have got to figure out a way. And I know that there's talks happening right now when we finally get a mayor next year or whenever that's going to happen, with making sure that person, because they really were not talked. This was really not brought up during any of the forums, during any of the times that people had the opportunity virtually or whatever to question the mayoral candidate. So, one of the things that I think has to happen that we have to start planning for is that whoever ends up in that seat, that the same pressure that's applied to the police commissioner has to be applied to their boss, which is the mayor.
So to our viewing audience again, I've come to you, Dave. To our viewing audience again, you tuned into the Chop Shop. Thank you for riding with us tonight. I got my man Shaka Piss behind the scenes making the magic happen. On tonight with Senator Jill Carter, Brother Davon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Anisha Martin, formerly the Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and Dr. Danielle Kushner, former member of CODIF, professor, as well as one of the founding members of Reconcile Baltimore. Go ahead and jump in, Davon, and what we're about to do is we're going to really shift the conversation towards solutions. Thank you to our audience who are posting comments. Continue to post them if you have questions. If you get them in, we'll get them up and we'll get you answers.
So I actually want to pick up on a point that both Dr. Kushner and Anisha brought up that I think are really important, and that's the relationship between police accountability and public safety. Because oftentimes those two conversations are held like separately from each other. And what's important to note is that, you know, as was mentioned before, if you have a police department that the community does not trust, then it makes it impossible for any form of policing to be effective at getting people off the street that are actually part of the problem, right? And so not only does, you know, greater transparency, you know, how to address the issue of police brutality, but it also spills over into the questions of public safety and making sure that police are able to be more effective. Like one thing in the advocacy that, you know, LBS does in Annapolis against things like mandatory minimums or sentence enhancements, you know, one of the things legislators say is we got to do something about the violence. And part of the frustrating thing about that is that the sentence enhancements or mandatory minimums have a narrow focus on the individuals for whom get swept up into the criminal justice system. Well, the short-sightedness in that is that they rarely ever say, well, you know, the police is supposed to be the agency that gets people off the street. They're supposed to be the people that bring the evidence to prosecutors, that allow prosecutors to be able to put people away. And you hear this rhetoric of you have, you know, repeat violent offenders. And the question that I asked a Republican senator, you know, during this past session was, I was like, well, if you have a repeat violent offender, why is it that the normal course of what it takes to a police officer find out who commits a murder, you know, arrest them, charge them, take them to a state's attorney, have them prosecuted, have them put away, why isn't that working? And a part of what I said was that there's an unwillingness to criticize, from the legislative perspective, to criticize the police department for its incompetence. They have a low clearance rate, right? And if you talk to people within the agency, you see that a lot of officers don't have a lot of the basic training that they would need to execute their regular, normal duties as a police officer that we would assume will be necessary to address crime and violence. And so I think it's important that we talk about police reform, both in the context of police brutality and in terms of public safety, because I think sometimes they're put at odds with each other, and you get bad ideas like the spy plane, right? Where people want to give a police department that everybody knows is corrupt, a police department that was caught having people selling drugs and stealing drugs and planting drugs on people, and you want that police department to have the ability to watch the movements of everybody in Baltimore City. Like, that's how we get really bad ideas, like things like the spy plane.
So I was getting ready to shift, right? But I gotta touch this, and y'all can thank my man Baron Smith. We're not really under time constraints on this show. The FCC don't govern and regulate what we do, right? But I gotta touch this. My man Baron Smith said the consent decree unit has been non-existent in the community since the new commissioner came on board, right? Now, I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna put it in a different frame, because we are under the third commissioner since this consent decree was completed. We had Kevin Davis, then we moved to Daryl D'Souza, and regardless of the circumstances, we are now—
Oh, you forgot Gary Tuggle. Gary Tuggle.
The interim commissioner, Gary Tuggle. So four, excuse me. You're right, Ganesha. So we had Commissioner Davis, we had Daryl D'Souza, Gary Tuggle, and now we have Commissioner Michael Harrison. And I wanted, how does this carousel, aside from the fact that all of these guys' money in most cases is guaranteed and the city is still paying them long after they're gone, we ain't even gonna touch that part. Break in relationships with advocacy groups and other people. How does this carousel of commissioners impact the inability not only to see sustainable change in legislation, but also the implementation of the consent decree as a priority for the people? Jump in. I don't care. Whoever wants to go jump on it.
Okay, I can tell you. I mean, go ahead, somebody.
Come on, jump in. Who don't nobody want it?
Look, I mean, here's the thing. Honestly, I have got the side eye. Not Danielle. I wasn't there, but I've got the side eye from everybody on this panel. From at the beginning of my work. Who are you? What are you doing? What do you represent? Blase, blah, blah, blah. And every commissioner gets that same thing, particularly if they're not from the city. And so, you know, it takes time to build relationships. You got to show up. You got to be a person of your word. You got to listen to the community, particularly if you're not from the community. Don't come in there trying to tell people how to be in Baltimore. You're not even from Baltimore. And so, like, it takes time to build those relationships and be able to get the work done. And you can't get any real work done if you don't have relationships with the community, like, period. And so I'm not even going to go into all the madness and mayhem and just lack of trust, lack of period, for the whole government, you know. But you just on a basic level, you can't do work if you don't have relationships. And it's if you build the relationships and then boom, somebody's gone, especially in stuff like this. Like, I had people who were down with me with this work who would not come to the police department, or if they came to the police department, they had to come through the back door. Like, this is like serious. Like, people feel like their lives are at stake, in danger, even to talk to the police commissioner. People's friends and community stop talking to them sometimes. Like, this is not a game. And so if you want people to be able to get the work done, then put somebody in there that's trustworthy, put somebody in there that knows what they're doing, allow them to build the relationships and move the work forward. And on top of everything else, don't give like lip service to the reform. Like, I can't really like express that enough, where you're just talking about it on the surface, but there's really no support for it behind the scenes.
So I think Davon about to touch. You want to touch this topic? Come on, Davon.
I think I agree with everything Ganesha just said, and I think, you know, part of the problem that we have in Baltimore City, and a thing that I think we have to really work on, it's the unglorious, unsexy work of building independent political infrastructure that is not reliant on institutions of the mainstream.
Yep.
And, you know, unfortunately, you know, if you're a person that want to run for office, you gotta, you know, raise money from the same people and go to certain fundraisers. And unfortunately, as a community, we don't have an organized set of organs where, you know, this is our independent fundraising for people that we're gonna run for office. Or this is our independent piece around how we're going to give our people a platform. Or here's the organization that's going to, you know, help volunteers get the word out about our issues. I think there are organizations that do pockets of that work, like LBS does some of that stuff, and there are other organizations that do, you know, other parts of that. And I think the work that needs to be done, and I think we're getting there. So I'm saying this in the spirit of, like, I think that there are, you know, our relationship, those of us that's, you know, on the screen here, like, you know, we're building, you know, this infrastructure as we go. But I think part of the issue that we have is that in the absence of a solid, solidified infrastructure, you know, you got people that want to skip the process. You know, they want to skip the relationship building, skip being in the community, and try to go right to, you know, some of the changes and reforms. And I'm just a believer that there's no shortcuts.
No shortcuts whatsoever. And that's a perfect segue, because I do want to come down the stretch. As I said, we're not bound by time, but I think we're at a point where we can really start to come down the stretch. And I want to put this out there. I don't want to be leading in it. I want to hear, this is a great place to hear the passion of this great group of people who are with us tonight. And I want to start with you, Senator Carter. Talk to me about the solutions, whether they're short-term, long-term, sustainable solutions. Talk to me about solutions. If I'm the person that's watching this broadcast that don't know a lot about political process and all that sort of thing, talk to me about what I need to do to save my son's life from being the next Freddie Gray, from being the next George Floyd, the next Tamir Rice, or my daughters from being any of the young ladies, the Sandra Blands and those that have been impacted by this topic. Talk to me about what I can do as a community member to either everything from holding elected officials account, and this is for the whole panel. I ain't just throwing this at Senator Carter, but to hold elected officials accountable and to be involved in this process to produce some sustainable change.
Thank you. Move from beyond protest to policy. Follow LBS and their legislative symposiums that they have before session to talk about the critical issues and work with groups. So many groups are now formed to come to Annapolis to advocate on and testify on legislation. But beyond that, know who your legislators are and be a registered voter, because legislators don't really care about anything you have to say if you don't impact their existence. And if you don't vote, you don't impact their existence. So you don't really matter. So you have to be a registered voter, whether you like or believe in the system or not. That's not really the point. It's whether or not you want to be anyone to pay attention to anything that you have to say, and whether or not you want to have a voice in the system. Finally, the biggest problem that we have in every area of our lives is our lack of political knowledge and understanding. We have everything at our fingertips, right? Like every single bill that any legislator has ever sponsored, voted for, voted against is right available on the internet. Yet, throughout this whole political process, I constantly hear, I don't know anything about this person. I never heard of her before. Well, that's not really the legislator's fault. That's our responsibility to learn about who represents us well and who does not. We have a role to do outreach and to communicate, but the people have a role too to know and learn and understand who represents them and what the process is. And we are too easily duped by campaign rhetoric and not by people's actions. That is our biggest flaw right now, in my opinion. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
I love it, Senator Carter, because we can't talk solutions without talking accountability to the people. And I think sometimes on these platforms, we tiptoe around the fact that there's some things that citizens just outright get wrong. And this last electoral process, this was one that had my head spinning. Brother Davon Love, can you come on and talk to us about some sustainable solutions?
So really 2 things I want to highlight. The first is, you're going to get a lot of policy, advocacy from, myself and from LBS. And so we encourage your followers to kind of check out our legislative package when we put it out. But the overall message and the things that we're going to put out has to do with the fact that we have to end the policy of policing themselves, right? Anything that doesn't undermine the police ability to police themselves is the problem. And so, we're going to be advocating for legislation that addresses that. The second thing I want to say, and it actually is very similar to what Senator Carter just mentioned. I think a lot of times when we look at mainstream corporate television or even in social media, a lot of the political conversations that are had are about national politics. And while national politics is important, the things that impact your life are local politics. Police, the criminal justice law, policing policies are the providence of state and local law. So these are not things that the federal government, any presidential candidate can promise will be fixing your community. And that's the case for whether it's education, whether it's your water bill, whether it's your BGE, whether it's roads, like all that stuff is state and local policy. So as it relates to policing, one of the things that's really important that has really helped LBS, and I really want to, express the gratitude that LBS has for the community of support that we have, because that community support is what gives us any influence that LBS has in Annapolis is because of the community reaching out to their legislator, telling their legislator, hey, are you supporting the thing LBS is doing? We support what LBS is doing. And so we make it a point to, particularly during session, to communicate with our base. And so, what I want to leave you and your listeners with is that it seems small. It doesn't seem like a big thing to write an email to a legislator or give a phone call. But when legislators get 10, and Senator Carter, I know can speak to this, when you get, 10, 15, 20 calls about the same thing related to the same sorts of issues, it has an impact. It gives people like myself and others the leverage to go in and get the kind of change we're looking for. And so I really want to encourage your listeners, reach out to your legislators, sign up to be, sustainers for LBS. We're an independent Black grassroots organization. So, we unbought and unbossed. We don't kowtow to any special interests. We speak unapologetically about racism and white supremacy, in the Maryland General Assembly. And so, to the extent that you can talk to your legislator, get on our email list, become a sustainer, support our organization. And when we put out our legislative package, it's going to be really important for y'all to participate. Call your legislator, tell them, what you want them to do.
Thank you, man.
Add 2 seconds, I promise. I just wanted to add that when you talk about the civilian oversight thing, what people don't know is that's not something new. George Floyd didn't make us do this. We've been fighting for this and working for this, everybody here, for years. It's now that just now, like, what did Will Smith say? Racism didn't get worse, it just got filmed. But what's going on is that people are becoming aware of some of the things that we've been fighting for the entire time. And I just finally want to say, yeah, email and call your legislator, but please be a registered voter in their district, or else they really. So I get thousands of emails from the Eastern Shore Republicans. I know they don't influence my election, my existence here. The constituents who put me in office, who have the power to put me in and take me out, that is who I listen to, and that's who everybody listens to. Thank you.
So I wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Davon said, because Pastor P.M. Smith put out a pamphlet that kind of upset a lot of local people. But literally the point that he was making, because prior to being a pastor, he himself is an attorney. And what the point that he was making is that y'all crying about Donald Trump, your problem ain't in the White House, it's in City Hall. And a lot of people did not want to hear that very real, in-your-face conversation. But Pastor P.M. Smith is my guy. I love listening to him. And we get ready to cut. We keeping the clicking down. Kanisha Martin, one of the friends. When we met, we were sitting in the room that it was one of those rooms like your mother tell you, y'all go in that room and sit there until you figure it out. We had some people from the Baltimore Police Department, and she was a part of BPD's legal team. We had some officers, some commanders, we had some regular citizens. I was tasked to bring in youth, and we sat in that room, and one day I got tired of all of the whooshy talk that was not real. And Denisha got to crying, and her passion came forth, and this lady was in there, cussed me out in Russian. She felt like I heard Denisha. That day, the Transformative Justice Committee was born. It was a 8 session process that literally was supposed to go 16 weeks that lasted 2 years, and some beautiful relationships were born. Some of us found ourselves at the White House. Not that it's all about that, but I'm from Lexington Terrace Projects. How I wound up at the White House was because I stayed consistent in that work. And even down to some diversion programs that officers are still using to this day to help young people in our city. So, Kanisha, talk to us. You're a friend. I just love you, but talk to us about sustainable solutions as we move forward in this process.
Yeah, I mean, look, actually what he says is, you ain't got no power. You ain't got no power. That's what happened.
You ain't got no juice.
You ain't got no juice. But what you didn't know is that I had gone to Big Mick and said, I need to talk to the community directly. I need to talk to hear what needs to be put into the consent decree and what we need to do. And what you actually don't know, and I've never really actually said this publicly, is that somebody that I love just months before that had a rough ride, not in Baltimore, and told me, Nisha, I thought they were gonna break my neck. So when you saw my tears, when you told me I didn't have any power, I was there because of the community, but I was also there because somebody that I loved had almost died.
Well, you actually did mention that night.
Oh, did I? Okay.
In your emotions, you ain't hold that back. I'll tell you who it was after this.
Okay. But anyway, but I'm glad that you brought that back up, because part of what I want to, suggest is mandatory conversations, like legislated mandatory conversations between police and community. We have to be deliberate about the voices that are in the room. But having worked in the police department, again, and I keep going back to this, but it's real. When the one thing that you held accountable for is homicides. You sometimes get looked at crazy when you want to pull people off of patrol to go and talk to the community. You know, oh, you want a whole day? You want hours to have these conversations? Like it's not sometimes a lack of will within the police department. It's like you are focusing on the wrong stuff. People are dying. You know what I'm saying? And I think it's to the point that Davon made, they are so intricately related, but they're talked about separately. And so while I wish we were not in a place where we had to mandate communication like that, like I think it has to happen, because it also shields police officers, the same ones that talk to me and the same ones that, you know, have talked to the senator, where they can come and have these conversations because they've been mandated to do it, as opposed to, you know, we talk about that blue line, but that blue line is not, it does not apply equally to everybody in the police department. That blue line protects some and leaves others straight in the code. You know what I'm saying? And so we've got to think about those things. So, you know, that's one thing that I would say is to consider some sort of legislation that mandates those type of communications. The other thing is that, you know, even to Davon's point where he talked about Phil Goff's report, that's part of the reason why I fought for the part of the consent decree, interactions with youth. And before I wasn't at the police department, I had actually found $25,000 to pay a company that comes in and teaches police officers two basic things. Number one, just because a child looks like a man, you cannot approach them that way. Cognitively, you can't approach them that way. And then number two, when you are dealing with young people that come from either a violent home or a violent, you know, neighborhood, if you run up on them, stop, what you doing? Like, you already have de-escalated their whole physiology. Like, you have now escalated. Now, you have now escalated a situation for a young person. Their heart is beating fast. They're not thinking straight. And now you want to yell at them and tell them X, Y, and Z. And you expect for them to respond in a way that's not, quote unquote, disrespectful. So you now are escalating a situation that you have a responsibility to de-escalate, but it really just goes off the tracks. And so, again, I think probably most people don't even know that that's in the consent decree. So I think we've got to find a way, and I'm gonna try to, you know, dedicate myself to trying to figure this out. Is we got to go to the stoop. People are not coming to know, you know, they're not coming to meetings. So how is it that we can translate this policy, translate the stuff that's in the consent decree to people on the stoop, so that we can start kind of facilitating that education, so that by the time Davon and, you know, the senator are asking people to show up, they at least have some concept of why they're showing up. Oh, you're gonna be able to stop what happened to my brother last week if we come and talk about X, Y, and Z? Yeah, I bet I'll be there. So I just feel like we have to work on that a little bit more. And stop asking people to come to where we are and be educated. People are not comfortable in that environment sometimes. So we got to figure that part out.
I think that's a major piece right there. How we've got to include the people that are most impacted. And that being said, Dr. Danielle Kushner, can you give us just some solutions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to say a few different things. The first is that we talk about involving community, and of course, the work that Reconcile Baltimore is going to do is all about bringing the community and the police together. Now, we're talking about every year, you know, essentially building this. Developing this infrastructure of trust building, right? And so, as I mentioned before, every year we want in every police district a cohort of citizens and officers going through trust building programming over an extended period of time, right? When you think about, again, going back to my point about what 85%, I think we found, or 88% of officers live in Baltimore County or other counties. Even before you get to race, people who live in the burbs, right? They have a certain idea and certain, misconceptions about people who live in the city, even Black people who live in the suburbs, right? They come in with these ideas about who we are as people in community. And the only way we can dispel that, right, is to build relationships. the trust building piece, which I also want to say, we also focus on officer wellness. We know there are good cops out there. We know that there are cops who care. One thing that we have in common is that cops face trauma, right? They deal with, you know, trauma for some people on a daily basis. We know that our communities have faced a lot of trauma, and a lot of that trauma is unprocessed and unhealed. So we really want to work on the relationship building piece. But I also think that, you know, I want to echo what Davon and Senator Carter have said about the importance of educating yourself, becoming politically knowledgeable, knowing what senators are doing what, supporting legislation that seeks to bring about greater accountability. And to that point, in terms of who we take to Annapolis, I think that in the past, you know, we've had awesome groups doing awesome work, No Boundaries Coalition, LBS, but I think we also have an opportunity to broaden the coalition, right? I think we need to bring in other actors who can also be influential. Where's the business community? Right. I don't think we can assume that, you know, the business community is vast and it's diverse, and we can't just assume that, oh no, the business community, they're on the side of the cops because they want protection, so they're not going to support anything that goes against the cops. We can't make that assumption. We need to be having those conversations. And then, you know, the third piece and final piece I want to say is that somebody mentioned a comment or mentioned something about, you know, should there be a law in place so that cops are required to be whistleblowers when they know about other cops who are engaging in misconduct? And, you know, it's been very encouraging over these last few days to see cops kneeling with citizens, to see police chiefs saying, you know, this is wrong, what happened to George Floyd, and it should never happen again. But, you know, I want there to be real opportunities for us to partner. And I think that, as Zavon was saying, you know, we have to understand socialization, that we've all been socialized in a world that places a hierarchy on human value, with Black lives being at the bottom. And so, you know, officers, I think, have a real opportunity, especially the new officers who are being recruited, to try to change this culture. But I also want to say that, you know, culture can be overcome, right? Institutions can overcome culture, right? If you want officers to act in a particular way, incentivize it. If you want officers to be whistleblowers, provide some incentives for them to do that. Right. So I think we have a lot of different things we can do. Trust building, wellness for both officers in our communities, supporting the legislation that's being put forth by advocacy groups. And the last and final thing I say, since we're coming up, since we've just had a mayoral election, results of which we don't have yet, but be willing to break your allegiance, right? We are so loyal to the Democratic Party. We need to start being much more thoughtful about who we support and why, and not just remaining in the norm, or upholding the norm, and remaining loyal to politicians, elected officials who are not loyal to us.
Thank you, Dr. Kushner. So we about to take our last ride. I want to give everybody 60 seconds, starting with you, Senator Carter, to just tell people how they can find you, follow you, how they can keep up with what's happening, and be connected.
Hey, just had to unmute. So thank you for that. So there's my email address. My state email address is right there on the screen. I am an avid tweeter now. I tweet. That's my favorite social media. So Jill P. Carter on Twitter. I'm also posting regular updates on legislation and legislative issues. Maryland State Senator Jill P. Carter. Also, if you go, and I encourage you to go, to the Maryland General Assembly website, click on any legislator. Look at their legislation. Look at their bio. But also, if you do that for me, you can click to sign up to receive my regular newsletter for updates. So thanks for the time, and I look forward to seeing you all in and before Annapolis.
I'm going to be definitely having you back, and it may not even be close to Annapolis as it pertains to educating and informing our people. Brother Davon Love, come on, tell us how we can catch up with you, keep up with you, follow you, all that good stuff.
So Davon Love, you can catch us at LBS Baltimore, all your relevant social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Sign up to be on our email list. It's an important part of what we do to keep in contact with our base, to talk about what we're doing, become a sustainer. As I mentioned before, we're an independent, radical Black grassroots organization, unapologetically Black, unapologetically about building for our community, building for self. And so it's the support of the community that allows us to be independent. We can't do what we do without the community support. Pastor Barb, I want to thank you for your continued support, the support of everybody, that was a panelist tonight, because that's how the work gets done. And so I just want to say I appreciate you and everybody else on here.
Thank you, Davon. Come on, Ganesha Martin, tell us how we can find you and follow you.
Okay, I'm not going to tell you about my 1994 Yahoo email. I'm going So if your great engineer can put maybe my Facebook, during this quarantine journey, I did determine that I'm going to dedicate my professional career to police reform. And so soon I'll be coming to you with a whole platform on how I'm going to do that. But for right now, I'm a granny on social media. So basically my Facebook, and then I think at Ganapati 1 on IG.
All right, thank you. And coming down the stretch, my colleague, my good friend, my sister girl, tell Jeff I say what's up. Come on, Dr. Kushner, tell us how we can find you and follow you.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing I want to say is that Reconcile Baltimore will be coming to you, the community. I just want to ask the broader Baltimore community to be open, right? Because we're asking, what we want to do with this trust building program is something a bit different from what we've done in the past. And so we will be coming to you, asking you to get involved and become a part of this programming that seeks to build relationships, that seeks to build trust, and ultimately, hopefully, reconciliation. So we will be coming to you with open arms, asking you to be a part of this process that we hope is going to heal our city. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us at reconcilebaltimore@gmail.com.
All right. And before we go to our closing remarks and our thanks and gratitude, we have an amazing show lined up next week. Everybody is saying throughout this process of protest, what about the violence? What about the violence? So on next week's show, man, look, run the video. I'm going to talk to you after you see what's up. That's right, family. We had a little bit of audio difficulty, but you was able to see it. Can we get the flyer up there real quick, shot? We are going to have 4 brothers who are boots on the ground doing phenomenal work in this city to talk about the violence. One of the things that bothers me when we hear those folks talk about what about the violence, it implies that there's nobody here working. So we got my main man, just ran for mayor, Carmichael Stokey Kennedy. We got my other main man, Captain from the Nation of Islam and one of the leaders of the We Are Us movement, Brother Captain Andrew Muhammad. We got my man from the We Are Us movement, a real OG, Eric E.B. Brown. And we got my man, everybody's Uncle T, Terry Williams, who's going to come and is going to talk about what it is to be directly involved in the intervention processes of violence in Baltimore, boots on the ground. All four of these brothers have amazing redemption stories where in their youth they made some decisions and it landed them behind the walls, and they've come back home and committed their lives to having a positive impact. So I'm excited about that show. I want to take this opportunity to thank our guest again. I want to thank you, Senator Jill Carter, for jacking me up and telling me I was having you on this week as my next guest. As always, you did not disappoint. I want to thank my little big brother, Mr. Dan Love, LBS, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Get with him. A youthless movement is a useless movement. Is what we used to say. A youthless movement is a useless movement. So we're thankful when we see our young brothers knowing that we ain't really got to pass a torch. We pass a torch because we running with both of our hands on the same torch. My sister, my good friend, a brilliant woman, Denisha Martin, thank you so much for who you are and all you've contributed to my personal evolution in education. And thank you for taking time to come and talk to the people tonight. Dr. Danielle Kushner, there are no words. I spent a lot of time hanging out with you, and I still do. You and our other colleague, Denise Duval. I just want to thank all of our guests, our very, very special guests, Mr. Tony Tyler, Baron Smith, Nisha McCoy, and so many others. You guys rocked out on the comments tonight. That's why I'm calling your name. I can't leave out Sister Eartha Harris, who does a lot of boots on the ground work in this community ourselves. You guys rocked out with us on the commentary. And I thank you for joining us. Share this video. Continue to stay connected to this broadcast as we'll be back on next Thursday at 6 p.m. Before I wrap it up, I got one extremely special guest. As much as I love all of y'all, ain't none of y'all get my very special guest who sits right here.
Hey, babe.
Hey, Grandma.
And that's the story of my life. My grandmother, my bae, the love of my life. Listen, y'all can follow me at Marvin McKinstry Jr. on Facebook. I'm Urban Theologian 1 on Instagram. My church page, I am a pastor. I love the Lord, and I love to do this work of bringing who God is to the community. I'm on Facebook, Victory House Worship Center. And my right-hand man, who's my left-hand man, who's my main man behind the scenes, making all the magic happen. I need you to come on the screen real quick. My main man, Shaka Hicks. You see all of this phenomenal stuff happening, speakers being highlighted when it's their turn, comments being posted and all that sort of thing. And I'm sitting here and don't have anything but the ease of making sure that I direct traffic. Shock, you there? You gonna come on and show your face and say hi to the people?
I wasn't ready for that. He's like, I'm behind the scenes.
Right. Hold on. Y'all see me?
Not yet. We see the chop shop. That's a good look, but we need to see you.
Oh, I know why. I don't even have my camera plugged in.
All right.
I got it. But yeah, I'm not used to being on camera doing these segments, so my bad, y'all. But yeah.
We thank you. You were the bomb.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. I'm glad to do it. Not a problem. And
yeah, so we ain't gonna see me today, Marv.
All right, we glad to come to you on Facebook Live via StreamYard again next week. I need everybody to tune in when I post the flyer, post the video, share it. I need y'all to tune in. These brothers are going to be dropping some gems as it pertains to addressing the violence in Baltimore. Look, y'all, we not playing with this chop shop, right? We got the show for the 18th. already booked solid. I ain't gonna tell y'all who gonna be on there, but we gonna be talking about where does the faith community fit into the community's violence prevention programs and plans. So again, next week, join me with my main man, Carmichael Stokey Kennedy, Captain Andrew Muhammad, Perry Uncle T. Williams, and Eric E.B. Brown will be with me to discuss what do we do about the violence in Baltimore City. We're going to be solution-driven and oriented on this platform at all times. Thank y'all for riding out with me. We're going to leave the same way we came. The voice of the soundtrack that you heard, I Can Be More, my main man, Corey Little. Take us home.
Oh, didn't know that's how we was going out.
I thought I sent it to you in the. Yeah, look, y'all. Next week it's gonna be seamless. We good though.
No, I have it.
I can talk to you about the song while we getting it loaded up. God put it on my heart to do a song that would literally be an anthem. It would be universal. It wouldn't be so much a church song, but it would be an inspirational song. I linked up with 3 young artists, man, who are super hot. They lent their talent to it. I did the production with my 2 little brothers. And man, we got this song that says Be More. Go to my page, find it. It's titled A Love Song to My City. Share it, share it, share it. Let's make it go viral. We about to hit the summer months and we want everybody. I don't know if people even still get systems in their car, but if you got a system, man, ride through the hood and for the kids, blast this song. I Can Be More.
I can be more. There's nothing that I can't achieve if I just believe. You can be more. You can make every dream a reality. We can be more. Be more, be more.
Yeah.
I can be more.
I wake up every day and try to be more. I pray I be more. It's easy to achieve anything you believe. Like hold your head high. Girl, you got a reason to breathe. I see around mine. Boy, you got a reason to dream. Let's take flight. Give the children a reason to see redemption. We grow up in the jacks where it's evil and wicked. Where the people with success don't want to send you a visit. But we still finna make this life worth living. Now throw your hands to the sky if you feel it. Hey, throw your hands to the sky if you the realest. You got a vision. Let's put them pistols away and make sure the OGs keep the community safe. In the world where the ladies crying, the babies dying, I think we can create that space to make a way for the ladies to ride and make baby giant. Be more, believe, let's play. I'm so in love with life. Little.